the fact that people have beliefs about languages being truthful, as in which language do we assume to be the one that is the most descriptive and romantic, these beliefs that we have about this unreflecting instantaneous access we have to, as soon as someone opens their mouth speaking one language, that we might assume that that is going to be maybe less truthful. And that does happen. And I'll just give you a quick little anecdote that in Canada, the bilingualism of our political leaders is often seen as duplicitous and therefore dishonest.
So, hi, Rachelle. Thank you very much for being here and to do this conversation with me. So, Rachelle, we have not spoken for about 4 years. So it's
Yeah.
really, really nice to speak again. And you just told me that you're in one of the coldest days in a while in over in Canada. Um, so the first question I want to ask you is a bit personal, and it is like, what made you become an academic? What was the trigger that made you decide to become an academic and a researcher?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's. I suppose I love the questions that we get to ask. Yeah, I love the questions we get to ask and the fact that we get to try to answer them.
Mm,
Um, I think I've repeatedly tried to go down a more sort of, maybe we would say, practical route of more employability skills that extend beyond academia. But I keep being drawn to these questions that I just don't think we get to ask anywhere else. That's the truth of it, really.
So the kind of curiosity that you felt was best fed in an academic environment than
Yeah.
anywhere else.
Exactly. And I do think we have a luxury in linguistics, especially,
Mm,
to be able to look at the language side of pretty much anything that we're interested in. I think it's a luxury that in other fields they don't necessarily have. And
mm,
I have to say, I try to, focus on that whenever I can, because there's always going to be some kind of language, discursive and or communicative element
yeah,
to our social world. And I think we're so privileged to be able to look at that as linguists and
yeah,
contribute knowledge that people don't have. Because, as you will know, we everyone speaks language, so everyone is an expert on language, right? But what we
yeah.
can really offer, I think, is that edge, is the actual empirical analysis of language data, looking at social situations.
Hmm. So language, yeah, so language is something that everybody does, and it's so much part of daily life. And then what you're saying is, in this field, we have this luxury of understanding a lot better what essentially what we do every day and how it
Yes.
works and how it affects life and that affects all kinds of other aspects of practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. And it's interesting because this is almost exactly what we say to prospective students. Why is it important to study language and
Right.
linguistics? And that's exactly that.
What
So
I say to my
within,
own, yeah.
sorry, so I was
I
going to
mean, I think
say,
my own thing, please choose a text to analyze that is something that you are interested in for whatever reason.
yeah,
And we'll look at the language dimension of it, because this is your chance to do that. You don't have that chance necessarily in other courses that you're taking. If you're taking this as some kind of, as a non-linguistic student, for example, here's your chance to look at any text you're interested in. We can look at the
you know,
language.
absolutely. And you know what? The more I think of it, the more I'm kind of surprised that not everyone wants to do linguistics. Well, seriously, I mean, if you say to somebody, the thing that you do most often and most regularly in your life, that is speaking and using language, and here's a chance for you to understand that better, or to get a text that you're interested in and find out stuff that you may not be aware of, and how it works. Like, I could not, if you think about it, it's mind blowing. Everyone should be doing linguistics. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So within that really vast domain that we call linguistics and the study of language, what is it in particular that sort of triggered your own curiosity? What was it that you were sort of particularly interested in and are particularly interested in? But at the beginning, I'm interested in the beginning, sort of the story.
Sure. Well, I did my undergraduate degree in French, and by the time I was finished my undergraduate degree in French, I started to realize that it wasn't just French I was interested in, it was languages more generally and the science of language, but I wasn't able to study that in my undergraduate. And I started to realize that even though I had a bilingualism certificate, I'd studied French for years, I didn't have a skill set that would allow me to do everything I wanted to do through the French language. And I was also increasingly sensitive to the fact that there were these comments on my French that people felt entitled to make, irrespective of their own proficiency, qualifications. I mean, relationship to me, it would be someone on the street or someone in a shop who would be commenting on my French. And it was those comments that started to make me realize that my awareness of what I had learned through my French degree, I hadn't been taught what French was and its role and what I could expect to understand as my skill set leaving that degree. And I was in France. I was teaching as a language assistant in France after my undergraduate degree in Canada.
Yeah.
And I met someone who was a PhD student, a French PhD student, and her PhD was co-funded by the French government and the Quebec government.
Yeah.
And I will never forget that she said to me, despite having studied abroad in Quebec and despite having been funded through France, being a native French speaker, if that's the term you want to use, she said to me, in Quebec, they either speak terrible French or they speak a different language.
Right.
And this is someone who was benefiting from funding, international, government systems. It was something that was so foreign to anything I had learned throughout my years of studying French in my undergraduate degree. It really gave me not a moment of pause, but I was in disbelief that someone could so profoundly believe that and yet benefit from an opposite view of that.
Yeah.
And that was really a turning point. That after that point, I went on to do my master's and then my PhD, and that still resonates with me to this day. Profound belief that someone would articulate in discourse.
Interesting. So this was like almost like the first real encounter with what you then later started talking in terms of language ideologies, I suppose, right? So how people talk about language as well.
Yeah.
Very interesting because you're already touching upon quite a lot of the things that I'm interested in as well. The idea that there's one type of French, another type of French, and one is somewhat superior than the other, maybe in some kind of belief, and also this idea of inequality, right? So there's an intrinsic link between language and beliefs about language and beliefs about language that are founded in this idea of inequality, and that either one language is superior to another or one variety of a language is superior to another. And and obviously for this person, the French spoken in Quebec was hardly to be considered French. Are you?
Not at all. Yeah.
No, not at all. Yeah, perhaps it's a different language. I mean, yeah. Are you? Do you consider yourself a bilingual person?
I guess that's another thing you have to come to grips with over the years is what it means to be bilingual, right? And
Yeah.
I suppose I would give an incomplete answer, which is that I will never be as bilingual as I'd like to be, right? And but it's, I think, again, one thing I try to do, because it's what I study, is to be conscious of what that means, to be critical of these different versions of bilingualism that I apply even to myself. Because it's not like as linguists, we are somehow immune or separate from
Yeah.
all of these
Yeah.
beliefs that other people
Absolutely.
have about language, but we as linguists
Yeah.
don't. I think we, almost more than anyone, you know, have these beliefs, but we sometimes try to support them with evidence that they aren't just
Yeah.
beliefs, that they are facts. But
Yeah.
I think what we need to do is really reflect on our own role and how our own beliefs underpin the agendas that we use to create our own research projects, right?
Okay.
The data we select and how we go about analyzing it.
Could our research unsettle our beliefs, do you think?
I completely think so. Yeah. And I think it's, I mean, I could give you lots of different examples from my own research, but we make assumptions that something is worth studying and that it can be studied and that it should be studied in a certain way and that certain data are going to relate to
Yeah.
a particular subject. Yeah. And so we make assumptions all the time. And luckily, we get to challenge those beliefs.
which is kind of almost the point of doing research in a way, isn't it? I mean, if we did research that simply confirmed what we thought we knew before, it's like almost pointless. It's kind of I'm sort of curious. I mean, this is a really basic question, but when you were talking about being bilingual and being slightly uncertain about that, do we have in our field a satisfactory definition of what bilingualism is?
Hmm.
So, like, how do you determine what an individual is bilingual or multilingual? Is that a way of determining that in a way that is sort of commonly accepted in, say, in sociolinguistics, or is it more, or sort of, does it escape a good definition? Because I'm
Yeah,
not
I
sure
think
myself.
no, yeah. I think that the fact that we ask the question about what language is and
Yeah.
where language
Mm.
boundaries lie and how we can, so-called, it used to be called crossing, right? But now we can draw on a linguistic repertoire that does not just rely on the
Right.
idea of a single language, but beyond that. I think we're asking the right questions. And I guess I can only say that I continue to learn a lot. I mean, conversations with colleagues who research bilingualism more directly than I do. Yeah, I mean, people are asking the right questions. And I think it is helpful for us to realize that we can help people to understand that there are different versions of what it means to be bilingual, to
Yeah.
speak, right?
Yes. I mean, I'm almost thinking whether the term is even useful in a
Mm.
way. Because I
Mhm.
mean, if we are saying if we are moving towards this idea that, people have a linguistic repertoire, and draw from it according to the context or situation and so on. And people don't necessarily have to have a first language or mother tongue or whatever, and or they have a collection of languages, and everyone uses a subset of a language anyway. So perhaps in a way, we don't even have to make a clear distinction between, bilingual, multilingual, monolingual, because in a sense, everyone is in a, to use a word that may not be accurate in this sense, everyone is in somewhere in a spectrum, to use that word, of multilingualism. And some people might be towards the extreme ends of the spectrum, possibly, but somehow, you know what I mean? It's a matter of degrees, and I don't think that we could identify a very clear cutoff point beyond which you say, okay, so this person's confidently bilingual, and on the other side, not yet. You know what I mean? And perhaps it's also a matter of personal um, perception, you know?
Right.
So,
Well, that's just it. I think there is, I mean, to assume that there is one correct or one really above all useful definition of bilingualism. I mean, that's just not where I sit. For me, and this is really what I look at, is what people think languages are, the roles that they serve, their identity with relation to language,
yeah,
and that is precisely what I study, and not just to do with bilingualism, but to do with language more generally, right?
yeah. So how people understand language as a
Mhm.
concept and what it means, and what it means to be a speaker of this language or the other language, and what it means to be a multilingual person, and the value that people attach to these things. Um, in fact, I was looking at that article of yours that came out in the Journal of Sociolinguistics, and the study that you did on the nannies in London, and that's really interesting because it's very much about that, isn't it? It's like the value of multilingualism, almost the market value in a way of multilingualism, and how differently it is perceived, also according to the components of the multilingualism, right? Am I correct? Like, which languages are part of the mix
Right.
and
Yeah.
which languages are not part of the mix. And somebody could speak three or four languages, or five even, and but some of those languages don't matter that much in the overall perception of multilingual, or the value of multilingualism, whereas some of them are absolutely key. So these nannies in London, if I've understood the article correctly, the number one criterion for multilingualism was the presence of English.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
English plus something else, and the something else was typically the nanny's own first language. And
Exactly.
that,
Multilingualism in that context didn't draw on a second language spoken by the nanny, unless that second language was English, right? So it was a very prescribed version of multilingualism. And you see this happen again and again. I mean, I'm working on a project on the United Nations right now, and you
right.
have the same thing there. What does multilingualism mean in the context of the United Nations? It's not that multilingualism means X. People use the term multilingualism to mean something very specific,
Yeah.
depending on what they're trying to prioritize in that context. And the benefit that might produce, right? And here in Canada, we use the term bilingual, and people do check themselves about it, because bilingual in
Yeah.
Canada doesn't mean just any two languages. And it doesn't mean English plus another language or French plus another language. In
Mm.
Canada, bilingualism tends to mean, and this isn't to say that's what it should mean, right? But that is what it, how people do use the term to mean, like
Yeah.
how they use the term bilingualism, it
Yeah.
means English and French.
Yeah.
So, if we prescribe what it should mean, it's not going to get us very far, because people will
No.
continue to use terms to refer to things that are meaningful to them
To
in that
them
context.
and to their lives and everything. I
Mhm.
mean, every time I have a conversation about language, unless it's about things like syntax or whatever. But every time I have a conversation about language and representations on language and beliefs about language, etc., the conviction that what people are really talking about is far beyond language becomes stronger and stronger. So in a way, we're talking about language and representations of multilingualism, for example, and so on, and what people are really talking about, and in a way we are also talking about, is stuff other than language, right? It's about power and it's about equality, inequality. It's about opportunities in life. It's about lived experiences and the ways in which people conceptualize language is very much part of how they see themselves in society and so on. So that's why these things acquire different values and sometimes even different meanings according to a combination of intersecting factors, right? Which are social and have to do with economics, have to do with gender, have to do with all kinds of other things. And and so language, like I was saying with Rwani the other time, language sometimes becomes a proxy, becomes a space where a lot of other content congregates.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
absolutely. I think it sort of ends up being the thing we can use to
Mm,
discriminate. Not that we should discriminate, but people
mm,
use it. It's seen as somehow neutral, right? And there are,
mm.
lots of cases where we can show that language is used as a way in to try to discriminate against other people. And it's on the basis of their language. It's not discriminatory on any other basis that obviously would be prohibited in most countries, racism or
Yeah.
class-based discrimination, but we use language to discriminate. And it's seen as socially acceptable. So,
Yeah, it's seen as social acceptable because you are formally talking about language.
exactly.
Language,
Yeah.
like you say, it's a bit more neutral and, it doesn't have the connotations that other aspects of somebody's, personality or somebody's, the individual characteristics may have. And so that's why it becomes that kind of almost convenient space where we can talk about other stuff pretending that we're talking about language. Sometimes that process is conscious, sometimes it's less conscious, I think, but it nevertheless happens quite a lot.
Mhm.
And yeah, so kind of language is entangled with all kinds of other things. Going back to the article for a moment, Rachelle, so can you give me like a really quick sort of in a nutshell what the study was about, what you were trying to find out with that study.
Sure. Maybe I'll just quickly tell you about the study that preceded that. So I had written a previous study, it's published in Gender and Language, about how multilingual nanny agencies in London are different from nanny agencies that don't foreground the multilingualism of their nannies. And so I did
Mm,
a linguistic corpus assisted discourse analysis of those two,
yeah,
to see what kind of words were associated with multilingual nannies. So I was teaching in London at the time at Birkbeck University of London, and I was telling the students in this master's course about this paper that I'd written on the websites. And after the class, a student came up to me and she said, "You know, I'm actually a multilingual nanny." And it was because she had had this firsthand experience, which I'd never actually been able to meet, someone who had worked and was hired in part, but for a large reason because of her L1,
Yeah.
that I was able to hire her as a research assistant, and she's my co-author on that Journal of Sociolinguistics paper. So in that paper, we worked together to interview multilingual nannies to see the way that they were talking about language, right? To see how that figured within how they saw the role that they played, the job that the work that they undertook, their relationship with the families, the hiring process that they went through, to really understand the way that language played a role throughout that entire job market. And I say the entire job market. Of course, we had a very limited sample by looking at a very small number of nannies. That was one of the projects that was really a major wrench thrown into that because of COVID. The last time I was in London before COVID was to interview some of those nannies in person. But yeah, so that's what the project was about. It was about how nannies themselves talked about the role that language played in the work that they were hired to do.
Yeah. So for them, being multilingual was very much an asset, would you say? It was something that for them, it was a trait of employability. Is that
It
right?
was. But what was fascinating to me, and despite me maybe interrogating them like too much on this particular point,
Yeah.
was that they didn't see that that language was in any way superior to any other skill set that a
Right.
non-multilingual nanny would have. In fact, they all of them went to great lengths actually to say, well, I shouldn't be paid more because I speak these languages, because nannies who don't speak these languages might have other skill sets. They might have qualifications or
Mm,
certificates, or they might have, you know, a range of other things that they could market, that they could monetize, basically.
mm,
Fascinating that it was just seen as an added value
mm.
aspect of their profile that they could use in the London market.
Yeah. But so to some extent, they felt quite modest about it as well.
Yes, they did. Yeah. And it was fascinating too, because it wasn't even modesty necessarily. I mean, that
Mm,
word never came up, for example, but
no.
it was really to do with the fact that it was taken for granted as something that obviously. So none of them, when I asked them, would they thought it was laughable that I would ask them if they ever had to show or demonstrate their language proficiency to the
Right.
families that were hearing them. It was it was so foreign of a concept that they would have to prove that they spoke the language. That, and I asked them, well, how did you show that you were proficient in that language? They said, well, I had my passport, right? So we have this mapping of national
Yeah.
identity, right, onto the language proficiency. And the parents, in most cases, had zero ability to assess the proficiency. So this idea that the native speaker would be best in that context was
Yeah.
something that was completely presumed and not ever empirically
Assessed. Yeah.
assessed.
So for the parents, was it important that these nannies somehow, whether for real or just because of a passport or whatever, spoke their particular L1? So from the parents' point of view, was that an advantage?
Sorry, if the nanny
So,
spoke.
so for example, if say, I mean, a number of the nannies that you interviewed were Italian, if I'm not mistaken. So, from the parents' point of view, so the families employing these nannies, was it important that the nanny was able to speak Italian?
It
Was
did.
that an added advantage?
Yes, that's right. I mean, to the point that there were no L2 nannies that I interviewed or that the nannies had heard of. And I say L2 as in they all had an L2, of course, but the language that was seen as the added value,
Yeah.
that language was never something that was their second language.
Okay.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
Italian was in that case all of their first language, and then I had Portuguese speakers who had that as their first language.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and
So
Spanish speakers.
yeah, interesting. So, and again, like you said, there was this sort of very strong connection in the perceptions of L1 even, or L1 proficiency. There was this strong connection between the language itself and nationality.
That's right.
If somebody
And no
was of a
question.
particular origin, say Portuguese or Brazilian or Italian, that meant that person is a speaker of
Yeah.
Italian and Portuguese and so on, right?
And there was, as far as, and this is based on the reports from the nannies themselves. I wasn't able to get access to speaking to the families, the parents who had hired them, but there was no question of language variation either, or questions about whether the variety of Spanish or Italian
Yeah.
or Portuguese was relevant in any way. It didn't seem to figure as part of the discussion the nannies were having with the parents. And I'm not saying that it should, but it was fascinating to me that it seems so important that it was their L1, and yet there was no discussion of maybe if that L1 was, the prestigious variety that the parents would ultimately want their children to be acquiring if we're in a position to be able to hire such an expensive care option as a nanny is in London.
Interesting. So do you think that that apparent lack of interest in varieties, how do you explain that? How do you explain the fact that variety didn't come, it wasn't part of the picture in this in the discussions?
So, I mean, I don't have the data to support an answer,
Yeah.
the real answer, but and all I could do was ask the nannies what their perceptions were of it. But it did seem, and this is speculation, but it did seem that because most of the parents weren't proficient in the language they
Yeah.
were hiring their nannies to
Yeah.
speak, that they were unaware. They seemed to be unaware or not prioritizing in any case the variety that would be spoken.
I see. Yeah. I find it quite interesting, actually, by the way, that you feel the need to say, I don't have the data, because
Yeah.
it's such a researcher's thing to say. I'm not going to speculate on something that I don't have the data for, to back up. But yeah, no, I completely understand. But because, when I was reading the paper, I'm listening to you now, I'm in my head, I'm sort of relating all of these things to the situation, to the global situation in relation to the English language, for example, you
Right.
know, and because I see some kind of interesting parallels. I mean, the study was done in a specific part of the world with a specific category of people, and yet the the stuff that you were discussing and finding out somehow resonates in different contexts and in much bigger contexts. So I'm thinking, for example, in the value that people attach to multilingualism globally and how multilingualism is valued or not valued. And I've been having conversations with my students from Nigeria. They're doing a master's degree at Portsmouth. And a lot of these students have been telling me, for example, that, one of the things, by the way, that you talk about in that paper is interesting is the family language policy, right? And these students from Nigeria have been telling me that family language policy especially in urban Nigeria tends to suppress local languages in favor of English. So what you're getting is a situation whereby urban middle class Nigerian families are beginning to elect English as the primary language and kind of sideline, Yoruba or Igbo or Hausa or other Nigerian languages, even if these languages are pretty large in the Nigerian context, and yet not seen as valuable enough. And so, and not only that, but even being multilingual is not seen as an asset or an advantage, and in fact, it's sometimes seen as a disadvantage because because of this kind of belief that if you speak other languages, those languages somehow interfere with your English,
Yeah.
and you might as well just have English in its purity, undisturbed by the presence of other languages. And, and you have almost like the opposite case in which multilingualism is not only, so, in the case of the nannies, at least there was a representation of forms of multilingualism that were valued. But here we have, in a bizarre kind of way, almost the opposite perception. So multilingualism is almost an obstacle, you know?
Yeah. You say value, but in reality, the multilingual nannies were not paid anymore for their language
Right.
proficiency. And that was, again, it was a bit difficult to draw that conclusion. And that came more from the first paper on nannies that I wrote rather than the second. All I
Mm.
could do with the second would talk about whether the multilingual nannies perceived that they were paid anymore. And
Yeah.
there was
Yeah.
very strong consensus they did not believe that they were or that they should be paid anymore for their language
Right.
skills. And in the first paper that I wrote, looking at all of the multilingual nanny websites, comparing them against the non-multilingual, now these are agencies that are
Mm.
actually marketing
Yeah.
nannies, and
Yeah.
sometimes on the basis of their multilingualism, supposed value of that does
Mm.
not map on.
Translate.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, when we think about whether we value something, it just appears to be lip service. And it's all about
Okay.
creating these niche markets where we
Yeah.
can have something that sets us apart from our competitors. Not that they won't have something that sets them apart from us on a basis that's not on language.
Mm.
Um,
So
what do we mean by value? I think it's an interesting thing when it comes to that.
yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Value in a very material way. These nannies were not paid more. In fact, maybe they were paid even less. I mean, at one point in the paper, I think they were commenting on the fact that those who spoke only English often were paid more money, right?
Exactly.
So
Because
yeah. Mm.
a native form of English is, or what
Yeah. Yeah.
that would be
Yeah.
that would be the term. That's probably a passé way to describe it, but that's what came out of the data.
Yeah. Yeah. So the value, yeah, this idea of value almost in a monetary way. So in many respects, then the situation with these nannies actually is not that different from, and the value again, in that sense of very material value of English isn't that different than from an apparently very different context of these Nigerian families that emphasize the importance of English and de-emphasize the importance of local languages because the local languages don't matter that much. And again, I'm kind of, my own interest is more, as you know, about English globally and so on. That's why I was reading your paper and thinking in my head, yes, there were all these echoes, and so I'm kind of wondering, going back to sort of to the global context, that anecdotal situation of the Nigerian families, which in itself echoes the situations to some extent of the nannies that you were talking about in London. Where is that leading us in terms of, yeah, our perception of languages, powerful languages, useful languages, less useful languages, multilingualism, is it a good thing and not a good thing? Because, I think one of the things that are interesting about for an academic to engage with the world out there is that in sociolinguistics, we take it for granted that multilingualism is a great thing, and it, we describe it in completely positive ways, and very rightfully so, right? But then in the world outside academia, we have these contrasting views, and so on the one hand, we have this kind of apocalyptic scenarios whereby local languages disappear, even fairly big and large, and apparently, resistant local languages are become endangered. The English language that sort of continues to dominate the scene and gets bigger and bigger. So we have that kind of mega concern, and also this idea of what do we do as linguists and sociolinguists and academics and researchers in order to achieve some form of impact that would somehow address these issues,
Yeah.
So this is a mega question, but it's a kind of question that's sort of in my mind, has been in my mind for a long time. What are your views about some of these things?
I'm not sure if I can address that, all of the
Yeah, it's too
components of
big. Take a bit
but
of it.
at the end of that paper on the nannies, the thing that I really wanted to stress was that despite this celebratory multilingualism,
Mm,
what you had were, undervalued work
mm.
done by women
Yeah,
in the home, right?
yeah,
And so for me, when we think about, okay, we can talk about how they were hired and there's a market and I don't know, there was this positive evaluation of
yeah,
multilingualism.
yeah,
The flip side of that, and which is very much a part of it, was that it was gendered.
yeah,
There were very significant power dynamics.
yeah.
And it ended up being a very much geographically isolated context where the language was valued. The language that the nannies were speaking was not meant to be spoken outside the home. And so what kind of message are those parents,
Mm,
fostering for their children if they're actually only asking for them to learn a language that's spoken by women within the home setting? Like, where is the value of that language beyond that?
mhm.
So with relation to that paper, that's the problem for me, is that there is there is a, what am I trying to say here? It's not as celebratory as we might have thought.
Yeah,
And when I think critically about my own experience in terms of language learning, I really wish there had been, for example, a linguistic component as part of my language degree at the undergraduate level, because I think there are so many things that linguists say and do and research and know and can
yeah,
provide insight on, irrespective of the language that is being taught, that I
yeah,
think would provide so much value to better understanding at the end point when you finish your degree, whatever
yeah,
that language is that your degree might be in.
yeah,
What are you going to be able to do with it? What does the research say about the role of that language in the international context? And I think
mm,
it's really linguists who are well positioned to be able to provide students, for example, more
mm,
information. But also that goes beyond the academic setting of education.
yeah,
It could extend into, language and intercultural training, right? We assume that we can just do this package degree and learn the language. I mean, I say we, but that's an assumption that often happens.
yeah.
But where is the intercultural, where is the socio-political that should
Mm,
accompany the understanding of the way that the language is spoken, where it's spoken, how it's spoken, and why?
yeah. Do you think, yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of sort of celebration, so to speak, as you say, sort of in our field about certain aspects of language and language use, etc. But do you think in general, this is something I've been thinking about as well. Do you think that we linguists should make a greater effort to seek collaborations, even academically, with people outside linguistics, people who are experts in politics and economics and you know um, history, people that don't do linguistics but have other forms of expertise about society, about how societies work, and about how money works, you know, and then through those collaborations we could then all get to a fuller picture of what it is that we're really talking about. Because even your study is a brilliant illustration of that, because you put in, you yourself said you got gender in there, and you have money, and you have socioeconomic dynamics that are involved, well, or rather, where language is involved in and is imbricated with somehow, but it's not the full story. So, we can study language, and we can study how people talk about language, and that's what we do, and we do it really well. Or we may do it really well, but I wonder whether we could really benefit from working with people that have other types of expertise about the same people that we research and about the same behaviors that we research.
Oh, completely, completely. And I the other, I suppose I see myself primarily as a discourse analyst, and there's a lot of work that discourse analysts are trying to collaborate with people, especially across the social sciences,
Right.
to apply because there's been this discursive turn about all of a sudden everyone's realized that so much of what they actually analyze is language and use.
Mm.
And so applying actual linguistic tools through discourse analysis. Yeah, I mean, so I do see that being a very beneficial. And like you said, it's not just benefit. We shouldn't just assume that we are going to be adding a value to work undertaken elsewhere, but we can learn a lot more about those contexts. That just because we have the language data doesn't mean that we know
Yeah. Yeah.
all of the other factors that gave rise to that data in the first place.
Yeah. And people who are not linguists can learn from us as well. So it could be
Absolutely.
a mutual, and then the end product could be something that's a lot richer and comprehensive.
Yeah.
Speaking, yeah, we kind of, projecting towards the future. Well, I mean, in your view, right, as an academic and a researcher about language, etc., what are some of the, or what is the perhaps sort of most burning question that we need to address right now? Where are we going? What's the direction that we should be going in? And what's the thing that you personally feel is most urgent to understand better, to address, to talk about?
I suppose I don't feel qualified to answer that question, is the
Well,
honest
just
truth.
for you personally.
For me, I think post-truth and disinformation is a hugely important
Mm.
agenda issue. And as linguists, we could study that in terms of discourse, but
Yeah.
also are going to be linguistic angles to that. The fact that people have beliefs about languages being truthful, as in which language do we assume to be the one that is the most descriptive and romantic, these beliefs that we have about this unreflecting instantaneous access we have to, as soon as someone opens their mouth speaking one language, that we might assume that that is going to be maybe less truthful. And that does happen. And I'll just give you a quick little anecdote that in
Mm.
Canada, the bilingualism of our political leaders is
Yeah.
often seen as duplicitous and therefore dishonest. There is an assumption, because the vast majority of Canadians are not proficient in both official languages, that the use of the other official languages by our elected leaders means that they are saying something different, right? And so
Mm.
there is a perception that bilingualism is dishonesty.
Right.
So this is one way, for example, and that I haven't seen that raised to the point of disinformation in anything that I've read or anything that I've researched, but I think it's not far off. Because if we assume that people are dishonest, we can start to have this belief that a language or a form of multilingualism like Canadian official bilingualism can be linked to a lack of trust in expertise because of the language that is used.
Right. So, are you saying that in the perceptions of some Canadians, the use of two languages is almost seen as being two-faced?
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely. Yeah. And part of the reason has to do with, in the case of Justin Trudeau, for example, I don't want to misquote the research, but there's some great research by Yulia Bosworth, for example. I hope I'm, going to be truthful to what she's done, but she's looked at
Yeah.
people's perceptions of Justin Trudeau's
Yeah.
speech. And Canadians, sorry, that's a terrible thing. English speaking Canadians
Okay.
don't like the way he speaks English, and French speaking Canadians don't like the way he speaks French. And so
Wow.
there, he is, it is impossible for him to please. And for me, it's fascinating because people just, and I'm extrapolating way beyond what she has talked about in her
Sure.
empirical analysis, but there seems to be this ability to discredit him on the basis of his proficiency in English, his proficiency in French, and the fact that he uses both languages.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's incredible.
yeah.
That that
Not
that
my research. I'd love to point out it's not my own research.
no, no, it's fine. Yeah, but that's yeah, that in itself is it's incredible in the ways in which, yeah, bilingualism can be seen in so many different ways. And again, that goes back to what I was saying before about, within sociolinguistics or linguistics in general, we tend to celebrate this and that, and then beyond the confines of academia, you have all these kinds of very, very different perceptions about the stuff that we talk about in very different terms. You know, um, this idea of lack of credibility
Yeah.
because you speak two languages, and therefore this part of you that I can't trust because I don't understand, right?
Exactly. Whereas if you had a very Anglophone Canadian who puts in a really good effort to speak French, but ultimately speaks it badly, sometimes that's seen as more positive than someone who
Really?
speaks very well, but ultimately not quite of the variety that is spoken by the vast majority of French Canadians.
That's interesting. Yeah, wow. Yeah, yeah, God, yeah, on this point alone, I'd like to have a really long conversation because it's so interesting.
Mhm.
Um, the relationship between languages and the way that languages are spoken and trustworthiness or perceptions of credibility and so on. And also, I mean, in a way, this also connects to this other belief, which is similar, that, languages are bounded systems that they don't connect. And, you either operate in this language and you are one person, or you operate in this other language and you are another person. I understand you when you speak this language. I don't understand you when you speak this other language, and therefore I possibly don't even trust you. And the idea that instead, perhaps languages, whatever language and languages that we speak, form perhaps a more unified repertoire is not something that is readily part of people's mindsets.
Mhm.
And the other thing, sort of to kind of approach the end of this conversation that I wanted to ask you about, is really in connection to everything that we said up to this point. What is the role of translanguaging? So, for example, if exactly on the point that you just made, this idea of a lack of credibility or greater or lower levels of credibility according to what language you speak and how you speak it, would speaking languages simultaneously in a context where your audience speak the same languages, is that because like in education, for example, in some contexts in education, translanguaging has been seen and has been championed as a solution to some problem to problems where pupils are otherwise forced to speak in one language, say English, and not Spanish. Whereas having the ability to use English and Spanish at the same time, both for the teachers and the students, empower both. And I'm kind of now wondering whether in other aspects of society, translanguaging or using different languages simultaneously might be a way out of these dead ends in a way that we are stuck in sometimes. These ideas that languages are absolutely mutually exclusive. It's either this or that.
Yeah.
And this means this and this means that. What about using languages together? And that's also, in my experience, often frowned upon. But is that a possible way out?
Um, Again, not sure I'm going to address that whole question, but what I really appreciate is it goes back to what we talked about in terms of bilingualism and seeing ourselves with relation to the language that we speak and being aware that there are different ways of speaking different languages to different degrees, and it doesn't undermine our ability to be a valuable member of a community. And I have to say, also to go back to one thing that we mentioned earlier in terms of our expertise and the fact that we as linguists aren't necessarily immune to these beliefs that might be problematic about language. One thing that has stuck with me from a friend of mine who is not a linguist, but who is very proficient in a few different languages.
Yeah.
And she highlighted this difference between in Canada, what we privilege as being, we might talk about being an L1 speaker of English or French or having both languages to a native-like proficiency. I don't know if people use that terminology.
Yeah.
And then this idea of being a term that we talk about in Canada is francophone, right? So if you are a
Yeah.
French speaker, it's a term that we use a lot in Canada to refer to people who have proficiency. But my friend highlighted to me that what is almost more valuable and something that gets overlooked a lot in the Canadian context, especially, isn't being francophone, but rather being francophile, right?
Right.
Positioning ourselves with a great love, respect, as being some kind of ally or advocate for a language. And for me, it was extremely powerful. Something I've not come out like seen in any research that I have
Yeah.
anything that was part of my education, part of my language education or my higher education, right? Isn't it incredibly valuable for us not necessarily to focus on our proficiency in a language and thinking of that as that bounded entity that you were referring to, but rather as positioning ourselves as someone who is really, who loves a language, right? And who is interested in engaging in that language to whatever degree they are able to do.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's really a different way of positioning ourselves in terms of the powers. And am I going to subscribe to this view that I have to be fully proficient, fully bilingual in this
Right.
language that might have different varieties that are
Yeah.
privileged to a different extent? No. I want to consider myself, and this goes back to that whole idea, do I think of myself as bilingual? And because of this conversation I have with a non-linguist, a non-expert, that I'd like to consider myself as a francophile rather than a francophone necessarily, because I think that really shows much more about how I see my relationship with the language that I really do care about very deeply.
You know what's really interesting about this story? It's the fact that through a conversation with a non-linguist, you have come to reconsider your own identity in relation to language so profoundly,
Yeah.
right? So almost in a paradoxical way, if you think about it, you are a linguist, and an expert in language related matters. Then you have this conversation with a non-linguist who talks about something from a different perspective and maybe even using different terminology. And that in itself triggers this kind of reflection in you about your own relationship with your own languages, and this idea of francophile as opposed to francophone, or as opposed to bilingual even. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it kind of, and that almost sort of is a confirmation of how much we need to talk to non-linguists, not
Yes.
just non-linguists in the sense of other academics, but actually, sort of what I sometimes refer to as normal people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Very intelligent, very experienced,
yeah,
very insightful people who have beliefs about language that are different from our own, or maybe not so different.
yeah,
But so just to really reflect on our own position as
yeah.
linguists, I think is really part of what we should be doing more
And,
generally.
and I think, okay, I think the one common word, one word, in fact, that we can end this conversation with, in a way, is humility. I
Yeah.
think we as researchers and academics and linguists, we need to acquire a sort of humility that allows us to see ourselves in a position whereby other people can tell us stuff that we
Yes.
genuinely don't know, and that genuinely can add to our own understanding of the subject that we are supposedly experts in. Does that make sense? Would you agree with this?
Yeah, it's not actually a term that I've used. I mean, but it is absolutely the vein that I'm thinking of, is that we should not presume, like when I talked about being immune. I mean, that's what it is, being humble to the fact that we
Humble, yeah.
are very human, very much the same subjects that we are studying in the area that I look at. I don't want to be too much of someone who sits on the fence or assumes that I'm
Sure.
looking from the sidelines, right?
Yeah,
This is and having those wake up moments where you realize that you're very much a subject in your own research project sometimes.
exactly. Exactly. So, on that very kind of philosophical note, I want to really thank you for this conversation, which I've enjoyed very much, Rachelle. And thank you very much. And I hope that your day becomes a little bit warmer as you approach sort of midday. And thank you.